So first, let's look at some typical state statutes dealing with issues like threats, stalking, bullying, harassment, and how all these things play out in cyberspace. And we're going to look at statutes in New Jersey because those are statutes that I'm personally familiar with. And they are typical of statutes in states around the country. There isn't really a model law on all of these issues, but I think you'll see similar kinds of things crop up. And as we go through these, I want you to think a little bit about what kind of activity, what kind of mental state, what kind of action, what kind of intent is required under these statutes, and how do these statutes interface with conduct that we might think is in some way disturbing or perhaps inappropriate, or at least some of us may think is disturbing or inappropriate, but that really is just part of the rough and tumble of living in an open society with a strong commitment to free speech. How do we draw those lines in these statutes? So the first statute I wanted to look at is the New Jersey harassment law. And you might be surprised to learn that New Jersey has a law that makes it a criminal offense, at least a misdemeanor, to engage in harassing conduct. And I want you to notice that this statute is not a cyber provision. This is a general harassment statute. So if you make or cause to be made a communication anonymously or at extremely inconvenient hours or in offensively coarse manner or in any other manner likely to cause annoyance or alarm, or subject someone to this kind of physical contact, or engage in any other course of alarming conduct or repeatedly committed acts with the purpose to alarm or seriously annoy another person, you are committing, in New Jersey, the crime of harassment. Now think about that for a minute. How often is this crime committed on a daily basis? How often might even you or I perhaps commit this crime on a daily basis? You might suggest that the entire process of going to law school is an exercise in being subject to harassment in some respects. I'm joking, of course, but you can see that there's kinds of conduct that we think, someone flips us the bird on the highway. Well, that might not be very nice, but I doubt that most of us would want to see that criminalized. Technically, it theoretically could be harassment under this statute. So notice how potentially broad this is. And certainly this kind of statute could cover online conduct. Now, very recently, within the past couple of years, New Jersey has added a provision to the harassment law specifically for cyber harassment. So notice the New Jersey cyber harassment law, making a communication in an online capacity via any electronic device or through any social networking site. So that would include, of course, your computer, your laptop, your phone, your tablet, any kind of electronic device, with the purpose to harass another. So there's an intent requirement, a purpose to harass another. And here are the various specific offenses: threaten injury or physical harm to person or property, knowingly send, post, or comment lewd, indecent, or obscene material to or about a person, or placing a reasonable person in fear of physical or emotional harm to his person, or threaten to commit a crime against the person or the person's property. So again, notice the potential breadth of this statute. This would include any kind of online posting, a comment on a Facebook post that could be considered lewd or indecent or obscene. And so let's think about the variety of kinds of comments that could be posted. And again, with the intent to emotionally harm a reasonable person. What is emotional harm in a statute like this? What would emotionally harm a reasonable person? Would a reasonable person, say on a Facebook page, expect a certain amount of back and forth that could be considered indecent or lewd or something like that? or not? These are interesting questions. There isn't case law under this statute yet. I think it raises interesting constitutional issues in terms of its overbreadth or vagueness and its relation to the First Amendment. Nevertheless, there it is. So New Jersey, like most states, also has a stalking law. And again, this is a statute that really arises out of the physical world, but that also applies in the cyber world. So one of the difficulties with a stalking kind of statute is going to be that we generally do have or expect rights of free speech, rights of free association, a certain amount of freedom to travel, and to a certain degree, a right to follow or pursue somebody. I mean, let's say that there's somebody that you're romantically interested in, and you see that they're going to a certain pub in that evening. You see them go in, you follow them inside, hoping that you get to meet them. Now, that might be totally innocent and not creepy. Or it might cross the line if it's a certain kind of conduct and become something like stalking, where it's disturbing, and it might become something that's disturbing enough that the law should step in. So generally, these stalking laws are looking at a course of conduct, right? So stalking isn't going to be one incident or even one or two incidents, but a course of conduct. A course of conduct in this New Jersey statute, repeatedly maintaining visual or physical proximity. So it's not just seeing the person go into the pub once and following them and trying to make contact and either succeeding in making contact or being rebuffed, and that's kind of the end of it. But repeatedly doing that, staking out the place, that kind of thing. Directly or through third parties or any action, method, device, or means monitoring, surveilling, threatening, or communication to or about a person. And there are varieties of cases involving things like GPS devices, involving the use of phones, other things like this to track people. Repeatedly committing harassment. So, as you might gather, harassment is one degree or level of a crime with certain kinds of punishments. Stalking would be a higher degree, a higher level of crime with other kinds of punishments. So repeated harassment can constitute stalking. Verbal or written threats that are repeatedly conveyed by any means of communication. So repeated threatening emails, repeated threatening Facebook posts, repeated threatening texts, all of these kinds of things can be stalking. And purposefully and with this course of conduct, purposefully or knowingly engages in course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to fear for his safety or the safety of a third person or suffer other emotional distress. So you have all this kinds of conduct that's listed, or other kinds of conduct that might cause repeated conduct that might cause a reasonable person some kind of emotional distress. So notice that all of these statutes are focused on intentionally causing emotional distress to another person. And we have to, again, kind of ask ourselves, how much emotional distress are we willing to tolerate simply because we all kind of bump up against each other in society? And at what point do we say that some degree of intentionally caused emotional distress is, in fact, some kind of criminal conduct? The next statute we'll look at in New Jersey is the luring statute. So, again, luring statute arises in the physical world, but it is, in a sense, often the use of electronic or virtual means to contact somebody or lure somebody in the physical world. So the statute defines as attempts via electronic or other means to lure or entice a person into, and then there's these various things: motor vehicle, a structure, isolated area, to meet or appear with a purpose to commit a criminal offense with or against the person lured or enticed. And so we looked at some examples last week when we were talking about child pornography, of efforts of some of these people in these chat rooms to actually meet up with these minors for the purpose of having sex. So having sex with a minor would be a crime. So if you're sending messages to someone who is you believe to be a minor, and you're trying to entice them to meet you in some kind of secluded space, like a dark corner of a park or something like that, for the purpose of illegal sexual conduct, that would be a luring offense. And this statute's kind of interesting in that it defines electronic means to include the internet. So it's casting a very broad net in terms of what kinds of electronic means can be covered, and it's targeted at this idea of using the internet to try and entice minors or other people into criminal conduct. The last statute that we'll look at in this section is the New Jersey bullying law. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this statute. It got a lot of press when it was passed. And the thing that you ought to notice about this statute, or one of the things you ought to notice about this statute, is it's not a general prohibition against internet bullying. If there's general internet bullying, then and it's going to be actionable as a crime, or someone's going to be culpable for it as a crime, you're going to have to look at the harassment statute, the luring statute, the stalking statute. Those are going to be your general kinds of avenues. The bullying law is specific to the education context. So this is really a piece of education law. And so you can see from this definition in the statute, it's an electronic communication reasonably perceived as being motivated by some kind of protected characteristic, gender, sexual orientation, religion, various things like that, or any other distinguishing characteristic. So any distinguishing characteristic could be physical thing, haha, you're short, something like that, right? That takes place on school property, or, and this is really important, or off school grounds, that substantially disrupts or interferes with the orderly operation of the school or the rights of other students. So this is an education law provision, but one of the controversial and interesting pieces of it is that it covers what is on school grounds as well as what is off school grounds. Now notice that last phrase, substantially disrupts or interferes with the orderly operation of the school or the rights of other students. This language is trying to get at the potential constitutional problems with a statute like this, because students in public schools also have a certain degree of rights of free speech. And if you recall from your constitutional law class, if you covered this material, the Tinker case, cases involving students wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War, or wearing a T-shirt with a profanity on it, or other things like that, and schools trying to prevent that. And the balance that the Supreme Court drew in cases like that is to say, yes, students in public schools have a certain degree of free speech rights, but there is an important interest in the school in maintaining its order and function and ordinary discipline. And so that's kind of where you have to look at this kind of law in terms of whether it interferes with some kind of constitutional or other right of the students. You balance all of that against the need to maintain order in the school. So the big question is going to be, if this ever gets litigated, I think in particular, is whether something that occurs off school grounds, and what that might be, interferes with what happens in the school in a way that this statute could be enforced. And what they're trying to get at here, I think, at least one of the things I'm certain they're trying to get at, is the issue of social media. So there are kids engaged in cyberbullying, and they may be engaged in that from their home, not at school. But the implications of that cyber conduct spills over into then the real world of the school, and people get extremely upset, or it even, as we saw in one of our introductory videos today, can cause people to really despair for their lives, and that can disrupt the school. So how do you deal with that interface? Now, a statute like this, of course, can't penalize all speech that could be in some way considered offensive, but has to draw some kind of line. So what's the line that's drawn is whether a reasonable person should know that the speech or conduct will have the effect of physically or emotionally harming a student, or the effect of insulting or demeaning any student or group of students, or creating a hostile educational environment for the student. Now, we do have to draw some lines. Ask yourself how these lines are drawn, and we'll discuss this a little bit in class when we meet in person. But are these lines drawn well? What does it mean to emotionally harm someone? Is all speech that someone might find emotionally unpleasant necessarily bullying? What does it mean to have the effect of insulting or demeaning a student or group of students? What if you're talking about German history and someone like me who's a German, has a German family, and you're talking about the Holocaust, and you're talking about the complicity of the German people at the time in the Holocaust? Could that have the effect of insulting some German student? I suppose it could. I wouldn't find it insulting, but I suppose somebody could. So is that where the reasonable person test comes in? How do we measure those things? I think it raises a bunch of really interesting and difficult questions. And the same thing with a hostile educational environment. That is kind of a catchphrase or a term of art in education law. And, what exactly does that mean? And when is an environment hostile? I think it's interesting to look at a statute like this in light of the protests that are going on right now on college campuses around the country. Now, this is a public education statute, deals with primarily with secondary education, but think about these things going on in college campuses around the country, and where are the lines drawn? When are these kinds of protests and concerns legitimate? When are they really efforts to stifle speech in favor of one particular political viewpoint? I think these are fascinating questions for us as lawyers. So what happens under the bullying law? The bullying law doesn't actually criminalize bullying. What it does is it mandates that local school districts have policies, and that those policies have certain requirements of reporting mechanisms. And the policies also need to have remedies, and those remedies include things like intervention, training programs, counseling, other action, which could include, say, suspending or expelling a student. It doesn't create criminal culpability. It doesn't, in itself, establish a basis for some kind of civil or tort liability. It simply mandates that schools have policies, that every school have a bullying officer who's able to take these complaints, look into them, do trainings, and so on. Now, again, this was a bit controversial, especially here in New Jersey. And if you are from New Jersey or are familiar with New Jersey politics, you may know that New Jersey has a long tradition of what we call local control. And local control means that each little municipality, presumptively, has its own school district. In many states, that's just not the case. There are only really regional school districts composed of multiple municipalities. Now, we do have some regional districts here in New Jersey, but the way the law is structured, it's generally very difficult to impose some kind of regional district. In every little town, my little town that I live in here in Bergen County, with 10,000 or so, 15,000 people, relatively small town in northern New Jersey, has its own school district of 100 or so students graduating in the high school senior class. And that's a very small school district, but we have that tradition here. And part of that tradition is to say every town should have its own local school board that should have at least some degree of flexibility to craft its own policies for the students in that district. So for the state, for Trenton, right, to come in and say, you must have this kind of policy and you must have this kind of officer, and that includes a hit to the school budget because you have to employ somebody to do that. That creates, some interesting issues and interesting dynamics. I should say too, having children now in junior high and high school in New Jersey public schools, it's very interesting to see the trainings that are done for students on these bullying issues. As part of these programs that schools have to have involve training programs for students about what bullying is and why it's bad. My son in junior high, in particular, is very, very sensitive to these issues and is actually quite quick to call out his older brother and sister, and even me sometimes, and say, "You're bullying," So it's kind of like bullying is the new smoking or something in the way kids get educated in these schools. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it goes a little too far. I don't know. It raises some really interesting questions. But as we've seen, there are some very, very real problems. And I think one of the themes, one of the questions that you ought to think about is, to what extent can law deal with these things? Or to what extent are these really a different kind of social issue that it's just very difficult for law to step into and deal with?